Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome to this live webinar. Thank you for joining us today despite the pandemic situation we're all in. We truly appreciate your time. My name is Eleanor Lee, Product Marketing Manager at Security Compass, and your host for today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to address a couple of housekeeping items. First, a recording of this webinar will be available after today's event. You will receive an email with a link to the recording. Second, we encourage everyone to raise questions. Please submit your questions into the chat and we'll collect and address them at the end of the presentation. We hold webinars that deep dive into a range of cybersecurity, privacy, compliance, and software risk topics every month. If you have been to any of our past webinars, I'd like to welcome you back. And for those of you who may not be aware of us until today, Security Compass enables organizations to accelerate time to market for software development as they shift to DevSecOps. With our flagship product, SD Elements, organizations can automate significant portions of manual processes used for security, risk, and compliance within the software development lifecycle. Our strategic advisory services and modular role-based e-learning solutions empower organizations to embrace DevSecOps, including industry-leading expertise in cloud security. Security Compass provides solutions to many of the world's largest financial organizations, tech companies, and many other leading global brands. For today's webinar, we're going to take a close look at balancing business speed and risk in DevSecOps. I am very much pleased to have here with me Altaz Valani, Director of Insights Research here at Security Compass. Altaz, thank you for being here with me today. I will let you take it from here.
Great, thanks Eleanor, appreciate that. And thanks everybody for taking the time to attend this webinar session. So just quickly, a little bit about myself. Previously, I was Senior Research Director at Security Compass and Senior Manager over at KPMG. My interests are heavily around research, collaboration, and learning. I'm involved in several working groups at the community level, including IEEE, the Open Group, Safe Code, CIO Strategy Council, and other academic and industry collaborations as well. At any time, if you're interested as well in collaborating with us, please don't hesitate, reach out. You can get in touch with us by sending us an email to research@securitycompass.com, or feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. More than happy to connect with you. Here's our outline for today. We'll start by understanding what the business wants. Then we'll talk about competencies that enable the business, and then we'll carry the conversation into mapping these competencies into value streams. We'll then talk about how we integrate business and DevOps pipelines, and finally conclude with some key takeaways. As Eleanor had mentioned, at the end of the presentation, we'll also give you an opportunity to ask some questions. Please don't hesitate. This is part of our involvement in the community. My role is to go and to facilitate collaboration and to share the knowledge that we've been gathering through our research as well as through collaborations. So again, more than happy to do that. So when we talk about business and business enablement, DevSecOps and risk, many times I've found that there are overloaded terms that are being used. And so it's important initially to ground our conversation. What does the business actually want? When it comes to security, the business is interested in three things primarily: cyber resiliency, compliance, and revenue. So when we talk about cyber resiliency, it's really a question of not if we get hit, but when we get hit, do we have ready mechanisms in place to provide a defense of our IT investments against these kinds of cybersecurity incidents that might come out. From a compliance standpoint, it's providing the business with assurance of compliance policies and procedures that we are in fact in the DevOps realm, not introducing potential breach of any regulatory or compliance mechanisms in place. And finally, we've got revenue and cost, which is part of any business. Are we, in fact, moving quickly against the competition? And you can already see that even within each of these three realms, we are looking at the natural tension that exists between speed and security, and how do we kind of bring these two together. Ultimately, in this gray cloud that we've got, what we want from DevSecOps is real-time risk assessment reporting against the activities that are happening at the program and project levels. Questions, for example, what is our compliance risk? Can we recover quickly? Is DevSecOps being a blocker to revenue generation, for example? And there will be trade-offs across each of these. Many times what we found is reporting metrics that come from a DevSecOps team tend to be more technical or process related. These are certainly useful, but from a project or program perspective, while that's helpful, when it comes to engaging with the business and balancing their needs of speed and security, it's important to talk in a language that the business understands. And we're going to unpack this throughout the presentation today. So the first step is mapping business needs to enabling competencies. So as we'd explained in the last slide, if we have a business need that's based on resiliency, compliance, and revenue, how do we now take this to the next step where we need to map competencies that will enable us to map to what the business needs are? Now, the good news is we don't have to start from scratch. NIST have produced a framework that provides some key competencies that we can use to build this kind of alignment. And usually in strategic governance type discussions, these types of competencies are generally mapped against specific business priorities with very clear indication of the programs that we will execute, and from a measurement perspective, making sure we've got the appropriate KPIs. Now, once we have these competencies, we can then map these competencies to value streams. And these value streams in the context of this webinar today are specific to DevSecOps and security and the whole software development, system development lifecycle. Now, the arrows in this diagram indicate that what we have before us is bilateral communication. We take the business need, translate them into value streams through competencies, and then provide feedback to the business on our effectiveness in meeting their needs, or potentially providing them even with alternatives for further consideration. So if those of you who may be used to strategy discussions or enterprise architecture discussions will recognize the alignment that we're trying to build here. And what we found from the discussions that we've been having is DevOps and DevSecOps really needs to go beyond the technical realm and begin to intersect with the business. And the intersection of the business is by the enablement of the strategic competencies. We spoke in the last slide about NIST and the work that NIST has done. So here's something that NIST produces as part of their NICE framework. And you'll notice that they've identified 7 different categories, which include competencies related to risk management, system architecture, network services, training, threat analysis, and so on. And the intent here is not to map every one of these competencies against the business needs of compliance or resiliency or revenue, but to pick and choose those areas where you think it's most relevant, and ideally those that you think you can enable relatively quickly. So what we talked about in the last slide was we've got the business need, and then we've got these competencies, and we can choose competencies that we feel are most readily available or easier for us to implement. If some are essential and we feel that we cannot meet these immediately, that's where the tactical decision on either outsourcing or building that capability over time through training, for example, could be a viable option. So now the next logical step is to take these competencies and to be able to translate them into the various value streams. Here's just one example of how you can achieve this. At the top, we have our business needs: resiliency, compliance, and revenue. And in the middle layer, where we typically execute programs, we identify several risk categories related to security, as well as several security practices and controls, which can now get pushed down through our DevOps processes. So at the higher levels, we're trying to balance these policies. And at the lower levels, we're looking at DevOps execution. And the middle layer is where this translation occurs. In this way, we're now able to traceably provide assurance to the business on our security posture. So for example, when we need to deal with resiliency, we may find that we can use standards and frameworks from either ISO or OWASP or NIST in order to provide assurance that we are in fact taking the necessary precautions to provide resiliency. Similarly, when it comes to secure coding practices or SAST and DAST, we need to make sure that we are doing these things in order to provide the necessary assurance to the business from a compliance standpoint, say, for example, with PCI or something like ISO 27001, for example. And then our DevOps teams are executing on each of these activities through either a security champions program or something similar. It's a separate topic on how you enable and sort of inject this into your DevOps teams. But for the purposes of this webinar today, which is to really help the business manage speed and security, this is the overall architectural framework on how you can bring these things together. So how do we now achieve this balance between speed and security? We certainly have our software development teams that continually execute against software development lifecycle, or SDLC, and incorporate AppSec dogfooding, security requirements, and teams are generally working in tandem in an iterative manner to produce the necessary artifacts that come out of the SDLC. We also have our testing teams. Now, I've put testing here separately, but that does not necessarily imply that we're looking at siloed testing. It can certainly be the case where we've got testing happening in tandem with our development. It's just that from a testing perspective, we generally follow a quality management lifecycle model. And here, for example, we would end up looking at producing some kind of attestation, maybe per commit linting, SAST upon continuous integration, pen testing for a final build that's been produced. And these are the kinds of activities that we would be looking at. And then we have our ops teams. They're generally focused on release deployment, network monitoring, looking at how we can go in there and achieve automation and speed of deployment, these kinds of activities. Our security team provides the necessary requirements for compliance against business risks. Now, we've got several teams here. And traditionally, what's happened is each of these teams has been working independently. And while we've had improvements for each of these teams, and they're certainly doing better and better in their own respective domains, the challenge that we have is these teams haven't historically been talking to each other. So the natural response from the industry was, in fact, to start to bridge dev and ops. And so we end up with this whole DevOps paradigm where teams are now beginning to collaborate. And this is continuing, where the discussions that started between dev and ops are now starting to include security. And the question that emerges now is, how can we possibly keep all these teams synchronized and make sure that we're all doing this stuff in a way that benefits all the teams, and so that if a team decides to make one change, other teams are aware of it. And the natural tendency is to go in and to look at a platform that can integrate all of these together. Now, because the objective is to go in and to balance the business needs and the security needs, really what we're looking at is a platform that will help us from a balanced development perspective. And this seems to be a new way of thinking, an evolutionary approach in the industry, where it's no longer a trade-off between, let's say, speed and security, but it's in fact both of them together. And the way we achieve this is through the collaboration and making sure that these teams, traditionally started out as just a DevOps model, is now including other teams as well. And I'll share with you what the implications of something like this are. So as these teams continue to collaborate amongst themselves, we take a look underneath all of these processes and come up with a security fabric. And this is something that essentially propagates across teams. Here, what I'm looking at is the security strategy team, the requirements to deploy stream, and the operations, security, and support streams. Certainly, as you continue to unfold this within your organizations or your teams, you certainly will find that there will be some variation of this. But this gives you some idea as we continue to move through this and we deal with things like MVP, for example. What does that mean in the context of artifacts that are now being created? And these are all live documents, for example. So for the strategy to portfolio stream, it starts with an enterprise strategy document, which is then converted into a portfolio of security initiatives that pertain to the product. This is then translated into a departmental level portfolio that gets transformed into requirements. And the portfolio is then monitored, say, on a minimum weekly basis or bi-weekly basis for performance. In requirements to deployment pipeline, the requirements are then translated through the SDLC into code artifacts, into build artifacts, test cases, security attestations, which then provide input into risk exposure to help us measure the portfolio performance. The operations, security, and support streams, they're essentially monitoring the application and the infrastructure on an ongoing basis, along with customer requests, for example, feedback, and identifying any problems or questions. These then get pushed into the requirements and deploy stream as a requirement. Now, should a problem manifest itself as an incident, for example, this then gets translated back in the form of a security requirement, and it gets deployed into the respective value stream. Now, it's important to note that each of these artifacts are integrated and they're monitored on a regular cadence to ultimately provide this balanced development perspective. So that we're dealing with things that are from a business perspective, looking at it both from a speed perspective as well as from a security perspective. So what does this look like now? When we begin to examine the execution and the operationalizing of this balance between speed and security, there are a few things that we've discovered in the conversations that we've had, and these are just takeaways that perhaps you can look at and see how it applies to your organizations. So the first thing to take a look at is strengthening your assurance. This is why we are doing this. Is security being adequately addressed in your organization? And this is really not just a development question anymore. It's something that involves the business folks as well. And what's interesting as a trend that we've seen in the industry, both in our work with standards groups, as well as in collaboration activities that we've been engaged in, business teams, security teams, audit teams are very interested in understanding more about the technical realm. And so they are already starting to get trained up on some of these kinds of competencies. You also want to take a look and see how is application risk being measured. Many DevOps teams don't know they think they do. It's really, we want to go, we've got a new tool that will help us with this. But from the business perspective, it's perceived as chasing this new next shiny object. So ultimately, the questions that need to be answered are, is this going to help me get to market faster? Is it going to help me from a security perspective, from a resiliency perspective? So a tooling discussion isn't the right language to speak about. Most of the time, we usually have high-level clauses, and this is many times we hear this, where we will have security teams putting forth a high-level clause from a standard like ISO 27001, for example, and it's very difficult to know how do we execute against that. And so what we've got here is this conversation that needs to take place between bits and bytes and the operational execution and the run books, with likelihood and impact, which is what a risk discussion is all about. So our security and DevOps teams need to sit down and work through this translation together. What we need to do is to map the clauses that come in from the security teams and map them to ultimately what's important to the business. What's interesting that we've seen is this can often be used as training ground to bring both of the sides closer together. And when we've spoken to auditors and when we've spoken to technical teams, there is a desire to want to help each other out, and this could be a catalyst for achieving that. And eventually we start to flesh out these components as part of an overall broader security program. One thing to keep in mind is oftentimes when we talk about security and DevOps and talk about DevSecOps, keep the auditors in mind as well. If possible, automate this, because they will want to gather some level of assurance that they can take back in the form of reports to the business and help them to understand where we sit from a security perspective. The second thing to think about is a reframing. Historically, security has been seen as an add-on, and much of the DevOps focus today is really on process improvements and integration, and it's usually done in isolation from security. In fact, many times when we have discussions, security is perceived as a roadblock to all good things to help us move forward. And we need to kind of change this mindset. For example, a few years ago, we're looking back a decade, 15 years ago or so, many times when we talked about testing or quality management, it was perceived as some new idea that maybe we need to add this on to software development. But today we don't even think about that. It's just built into what we do. So in the same way, when we release without, when we release with sort of the testing built into our value stream, similarly, when we talk about security, eventually the question is going to be around, well, why wouldn't we think about security? That's just a normal part of how we do software development. So security is baked into the essence of what it means to do quality software development. The other thing is many times teams rely on using code scanners as a measure of security. It's useful. We found that in our discussions and even from our own experience, using code scanners can be noisy and could add more work to your program management teams as it kind of slows down the work that needs to be done. So there is a way to go in and to work beyond just using code scanners by instilling secure practices and some of the things that we talked about earlier, bringing the audit teams along, bringing along the security teams, and just working with them. The other thing is looking at security documentation, especially when we get into things like threat modeling. Security and threat modeling go hand in hand. The intent is not to just throw a data flow diagram over the fence and okay, there we go, we're now going to be compliant. We do need these activities, but we need to do this in a way where it's not just a one-time activity. Threat modeling can in fact be seen as an ongoing living exercise. So as we learn more, as we move forward in our software development activities or system development activities, what does this now do to our threat modeling? Are we introducing new threats? And this is important for an auditor to be able to understand this, because when the report goes back up to the business again, it has a direct impact on resiliency. And these are the kinds of activities that we're talking about. Through the competencies, we are now able to go in there and map to what's important to the business. The third thing to think about is push for greater enterprise collaboration. Now, admittedly, collaboration is hard. We've got teams that traditionally have been working in silos. Systems are not integrated. Processes are not integrated. Culture sometimes gets in the way. And in some cases, you may not even be allowed to share certain information. Maybe there's a particular regulatory or compliance requirement that prohibits, for example, a developer from being able to obtain relevant data. And this is great. It happens. It's important to recognize it. So what we intend to do in a situation like that is to work through these issues together. If we can't provide information, what else can we do to provide a proxy for that information? And just making sure that this collaboration is top of mind in moving forward. There's also this lack of accountability. We've seen many times all too common things were sort of getting thrown over the fence. It's not surprising from an architecture perspective. And again, the thought is not to look at it from a systems architecture, from a business architecture perspective. When we throw things over the fence, the tendency to say, you know, now my work is done. It's now your responsibility to help move this forward. And what can happen is oftentimes there's this us versus them, zero-sum kind of mentality that kicks in. Instead of that, what we can do is we can spin up teams of individuals who are able to collaborate together. And one approach we've seen is to pick up champions from each of these respective domains, bring them together, and see if we can now work on ways to help us achieve that which is important ultimately to the business. And sometimes it's just difficult because we just can't speak the same language. We've talked about this earlier, where DevSecOps teams and the business don't share even the same semantics. What means risk to the business could be very different from what we mean when we talk about risk with DevOps or DevSecOps teams. You know, in the sense of we are limited in our capacity to be able to produce an artifact or a build, for example. But ultimately, we need to be able to translate these two together. And what we're trying to do is we want to, when it comes to providing an assurance back to the business, we want to evolve this to the level where it's not just a developer, for example, coming back and saying, yes, I've done this, but in fact, looking at some automated verification and validating this together. So whether it's done using SaaS or some automated mechanisms, we now have at least 2 data points that we can provide back to the business in the form of assurance. You want to train your business and your DevOps teams. Lack of skills essentially goes both ways. We've got developers who don't do security as well as they should. We've got the case of customers, or in the case of internal customers where we've got the business, they just don't even know where to start. Sometimes we'll end up with some pretense that happens, and so there are security requirements that get put out, but these security requirements are essentially just masked. They're, you know, even though we're talking about security, they're not really security requirements. They're intended to go in there and drive functionality, essentially. And so, you know, when we talk about training teams, and oftentimes we'll hear things about best practices, but if the best practices are based on not even having the most basic skills, then we end up in a situation where we've got the blind leading the blind. And that really doesn't help us to move forward. Security champions can certainly help this. And as you scale up your DevSecOps program and you look at the necessary competencies, how are these competencies going to ultimately enable what the business is looking for? So oftentimes we'll hear things like, you know, we want to initiate a security champion program, and the immediate question that comes in from the business is, what business value is this going to provide us? And if the intent is, oh, we're going to end up with better training for our developers, that's great, but the problem is that doesn't address a business need. It addresses a technical need. But if you map that back to say this will now help us to better manage our assurance or help us to comply with a given standard or regulation, now you're dealing with something that the business can understand. And therein lies the opportunity to develop your security champions program. So what we need as well is this secure coding training. Something that is easily understood in the terms of requirements, not things that are thrown over the fence. And we're looking at this policy translation layer that we were talking about. So we've got policies from the business side coming to the programs, from the programs coming in and executing technically to our DevOps teams. And finally, make this a part of your DNA. Create the right metrics, make these meaningful to the business, and something that is easy to gather. When we deal with issues around the business, this is where a discussion that happens between both the business and technical teams helps, because we can now balance the need for speed and security. We also want to build cross-functional empathy. And by working together, we are able to achieve this. This will require some kind of change management activity. Some teams have never worked together before. Some teams don't truly understand what the other teams are concerned about. We also want to take a look at ways of integrating processes for better security. And this is a big one, because when we talk about integrating processes, it's no longer just dealing with dev and ops, but we've got security now, we've got business as well, we've got architecture in here. How do we go in and build from a security perspective this cross-functional empathy? And then we also want to build an internal knowledge base over time. In discussions that we've had across the industry with some of our partners, what we found is many times valid, really good assumptions and insights have been generated, but the challenge is this isn't stored anywhere. So we need to start to capture these insights and begin to get this propagated and radiated in a way that helps other teams make sense of this. And so we're beginning to link now fact and context together. So for example, we may have an architecture team that will discover something which may in fact be useful for the security teams to understand. And so when we look back at the diagram that we had around balanced development, by putting it into this platform that everybody can share, we're now in a much better position for the security teams to be able to adjust some of the policies that they've been creating, so that we can now work together in a way that's more efficient to achieve what the business is looking for. There's a whole webinar that we can put together around creating this internal knowledge base, but we won't get into those things. There are certainly many things to consider. For example, relative maturity levels. How do you go from something where the knowledge base resides primarily within people's own internal, inside their heads, their own internal mechanisms, their own internal notes, all the way up to something we've got a formalized knowledge base that people can go in and they can collaborate against and make amendments to that knowledge base over time. And finally, the goal here is to really work towards forward-looking insight generation. Ultimately, we want to be able to query the knowledge base for insights and for axioms. If we've got concepts and we've got relationships between these concepts, why do these relationships exist? Are they still valid in each iteration of our MVP across the artifact fabric? Or is it something that we need to modify now? And how are we going to make sure that our auditors are aware that this is what's happening? We also create a feedback loop into DevOps and business teams now. So the discussion that originally started out as being a technical stream of just Dev and Ops is essentially turning into an ownership where the business is now accountable for DevOps. And in fact, we are seeing this in the industry where we have regulations and we've got standards that are now pushing for executives to be held more accountable for DevOps. And it's in this context that we are evolving the way DevOps works and how it now makes sense for the business. So in summary, there are a few key takeaways that I'd like to bring to the table. DevSecOps is also now a business problem. It's not just a technical one. So it implies not just security teams, but compliance teams, audit teams, business strategists. And as we evolve this over time, we're also seeing at the standards level where we're starting to get legal teams involved with this, because it also starts to touch into ethical considerations. And what does it now mean when we're producing software or systems from an ethical perspective? The second thing is work to strengthen your assurance program to show business value. Ultimately, it comes down to that business value. There's an evolution now to make sure that whatever we are doing, because software development is such a key part of every organization today, what does this now look like for the business to make an investment in software development and systems and data and infrastructure so that the business value is in fact being accrued? And business value, again, comes to those three things that we had talked about. It's around assurance, it's around compliance, and it's around revenue and cost. The third thing is to shift the conversation so that security is in fact synonymous with quality now, rather than looking at security as just an add-on. We also want to push for greater collaboration across enterprise teams. The recommendation is to start small initially before growing further. Pick the low-hanging fruit. Move forward with those areas that are reasonable. Make sure you're able to provide quick value from that, quick value in the sense of the business value. And therein lies the opportunity to then extend that program further. This will take some change management from your DevOps team to understand why it is some of the things are being done and how it's impacting them from the automation and security perspective. And finally, training your biz and DevOps teams to speak each other's languages at this point. It's already well underway. Many times I've heard now technical teams are beginning to converse along terms related to risk and compliance. In fact, we hold the opinion that compliance and the software development lifecycle are in fact on the cusp of essentially merging at this point in the industry. And so we are seeing software development now becoming very much compliance driven. So these are the kinds of things that we are seeing. So as a summary, we'd like to see these as key takeaways from the presentation today. And at this point, I'd like to open this up to any questions that anyone might have. Perhaps I'll hand it over to you, Eleanor, if there were any questions that came up from chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Altaz. Yeah, you're right. I just wanted to thank you for a rich discussion on security competencies to enable the business and strategies to balance speed and risk in DevSecOps. And yeah, we would like to open it up to questions. Feel free to type it into the chat window. I did get a couple of questions during your presentation. So one is, does DevSecOps imply massive organizational change management?
That's a really good question. When we talk about change management, there are several things to consider. You have to make sure that you've got the right key stakeholders that have bought into change management. You need to make sure you've got the quick wins and the metrics and the KPIs are in place. You need to make sure you've got the right training in place for teams as well. And in a world of agility, and we're even seeing this at the business level, going through a massive change management program is likely not the best solution to go for. The intent is to evolve this and to really retain the agility from a business perspective, but doing this incrementally. Get the low-hanging fruit first, work with that, get your quick wins, show people that the wins are in fact helping the business to move forward, and then take it to the next level and then look for what additional competencies you can build. So to answer the question, while it could be perceived that this is going to be a massive change management initiative, the suggestion I would make is don't approach it from that standpoint. Please consider what's the low-hanging fruit. Now, every organization is different. The aptitude for digesting change, the willingness of individuals, the necessary policies that are in place will all impact how quickly change management can work. And so really perceive change management as being an activity activity that is evolutionary on an ongoing basis to align with agility rather than being an end state where we've got to have everything lined up. And now we've got this massive change management program that's going to help us move forward. That's the approach that I would end up taking.
Thank you, Altaz. We have another question from the audience. Let me just pull it up. It is, so I'm hearing that the business owns a software development lifecycle, but many of them don't understand the development process. Is this accurate? Is this an accurate picture? And if so, can you elaborate further?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So keep in mind that the business is focused on a different set of criteria. They are not technical, although they are understanding technology much better. It is rather difficult to assume that a business individual will come in and have a profound understanding of how software development works and all the tools and technologies, just as we would if we flip the coin to expect someone who's in systems development or DevSecOps to try to understand everything there is to know about risk management, risk attestation, dealing with compliance. Everybody has their areas of strength. So from the business perspective, while they may not have a deep understanding of the technology domain, by translating the information in the technology domain, you provide the business with the necessary information to make these key decisions. So for example, if you want to spin up a program that maybe is based on cloud enablement, what value is this going to provide to the business? And speaking in their terms enables them to ask these questions from the resiliency perspective, for example, which can then be translated in the technical domain around things like we've got to develop competencies around cloud development, for example, which can be different from the way we've traditionally been doing this. And so when we look at the fact that because the business traditionally hasn't been doesn't have the deep expertise, it doesn't mean that we shut them out. This is no longer the case in the industry. It's really about bringing the business along, and similarly for those on the business side to bring the technical teams along. I think the sort of looking at it from they don't understand this, therefore we are going to move forward is a remnant of much of the silo thinking that's permeated historically. We're in a new world now. We all want to strive for agility. And within that context, the question becomes, how do we empathize with these other teams and how do we bring them along? Because if we make a decision, later on, we may find that that was not the original intent of some of these other teams, which then in essence is slowing you down, and that sort of deteriorates the business value over time. And from a technical perspective, we just end up accruing more technical debt as a result of that. So yes, historically we've had that problem from a business context, but there are things we can definitely do today to help the business come along.
Very good points. Really crucial to get business engagement from the get-go. Another question is from someone in the audience. So one of our challenges is that developers don't have the time to learn all the business lingo. How do we address this problem?
Yeah, so this is the flip side of the coin. Because we've got the technical teams really largely focused on doing software development and system development, that space alone is moving so rapidly. Just trying to keep up with the technical domain is a challenge in itself. Now we start to add on some of these things like compliance and risk. It really is difficult. Set realistic expectations. The best way to achieve this is to go and to talk to people who are the experts in these domains. If at some point it becomes essential and strategic that the development teams understand some of these concepts, then you can initiate a training program that would help bring your teams along and begin to set up the necessary metrics and key results that you can then map to ensure that your teams are becoming more and more business savvy over time. So yes, it is a real problem. One approach that we've seen as a starting point is the initiation of a security champions program, and really beginning to bring in security concepts into the development domain. And by looking at it from a risk perspective, it starts to get the ball rolling to say, hey, maybe there's something else that we need to consider other than things like speed of deployment, a bug count, or things like that. What about looking at it from a risk perspective? And doing this in such a way that still helps development teams to achieve the necessary efficiencies. And this is where we start to see the balance, right? Ultimately, the goal of DevOps isn't just to release product. It's, yes, to enable the business, but at the same time, to help the business manage the risk. And because the business teams don't understand as well the technical domain, it becomes the responsibility of the team that happens to be a champion in that area to be able to explain this and bring these other teams along. So you know, I would suggest that a recognition that development teams have a gap in their understanding is a good starting point. The question that I would ask then is, what competencies would such a team need to develop in order to achieve the necessary alignment with business risk? And talking to the respective teams and bringing them along, and jointly creating the necessary requirements and metrics to ensure that we're able to move forward.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody for raising these questions. These are really great questions. And Altaz, thank you again for a very informative session. So I think this concludes our webinar today. Again, we will provide a link to the recording of this webinar to everyone here via email. Do join us in our webinar on April 16th for yet another expert discussion on delivering and scaling secure microservice-based products for any cloud, be it on-premise, off-premise, hosted or SaaS, and government cloud. It's a really interesting topic. I'm very keen to be there myself. We will post the registration information very soon in the resources page of our website at securitycompass.com. So please head over there to sign up. Thank you everyone for attending this webinar. Stay safe and well, and have a great day.